Snow crunched under heavy iron-shod boots, breaking the absolute silence of the dying woods. The messenger didn't bother to knock on the splintering wood of the cabin door. He simply shoved the thick parchment against Cora's chest. A heavy red wax seal held it closed, stamped with a snarling wolf. An invitation to the bonding ceremony of her former mate. He wanted her in the crowd. He wanted her broken weeping while he elevated another. She stared at the wax, feeling nothing but cold resolve. The grieving was over. The axe came down with a sharp, echoing crack, splitting the pine log perfectly in two. Cora didn't stop. She reached for another piece of wood, set it on the block, and swung again. Splinters flew, catching in the messy braid of her dark hair. Her breath plumed in the freezing morning air, mingling with the scent of pine sap and the metallic tang of impending snow. She was sweating despite the bitter chill. Manual labor was the only thing that kept the phantom ache at bay. The dull, throbbing pain sat deep in her chest, right behind her collarbone, where the mating mark used to be. Now it was just a jagged, pale scar, a permanent reminder that she was a discard. Hoofbeats interrupted the rhythm of her work. Cora leaned on the handle of her axe, wiping a streak of dirt from her forehead with the back of a calloused hand. A single rider broke through the tree line. It was Gregory the Baiter of the Ashdown pack. He looked out of place in this desolate stretch of the territory, his fine woolen cloak lined with expensive sable, his horse a magnificent roan that huffed nervously at the scent of Cora's dilapidated cabin. Cora didn't greet him. She just watched him dismount, her eyes flat-tired. She had run out of tears 6 months ago. Gregory hesitated. He wouldn't meet her eyes. That was the thing about the Ashdown pack. They were all very good at looking away from the mess their alpha had made. Cora. He muttered, his voice gruff, lacking its usual authoritative boom. Gregory, she replied. Her voice was scratchy from disuse. She hadn't spoken to another soul in 3 weeks. You're a long way from the High Hall. Did you get lost looking for the privy? He winced. He reached inside his cloak and pulled out a thick envelope of heavy vellum. He held it out like it was a live coal. Desmond sent me. He wants you to have this. Cora didn't move. She stared at the parchment. She knew exactly what it was without having to open it. The whole territory knew. Desmond, the newly minted alpha of Ashdown, was taking a mate. Lyanna of the Riverlands. A political match. A strong wolf with a pedigree that stretched back centuries. Everything Cora was not. Put it on the block. Cora said, her tone utterly devoid of emotion. Gregory swallowed hard. He stepped forward, his polished boots sinking into the freezing mud, and set the invitation on the tree stump next to her axe. He expects you to attend, Cora. Does he? She let out a short, humorless laugh. Why does he need someone to serve the wine? Don't do that, Gregory said softly, finally meeting her gaze. There was pity in his eyes, and she hated him for it. He wants to show the allied packs that there is no bad blood, that the transition was peaceful. Peaceful. Cora touched her collarbone unconsciously. Desmond had rejected her in front of the entire pack council. He had cited her weak wolf, her lack of noble blood, her inability to command respect. He had ripped the bond from her chest with all the grace of a butcher, leaving her bleeding on the stone floor of the hall. Tell Desmond he can take his peaceful transition and choke on it. Gregory sighed, a white puff of vapor in the cold. If you don't show it looks like you're defying him. You know how he gets. He might revoke your right to live on the fringe lands. He might exile you entirely. I am already exiled, Gregory. I'm just doing it within his borders. Cora picked up the axe again. Tell him I received it. Tell him whatever you want. Just get off my land. Gregory lingered for a second longer, perhaps hoping for a breakdown, perhaps hoping for absolution. When Cora simply brought the axe down on another log, splitting it with violent precision, he turned and mounted his horse. He rode away without another word. When the sound of hoofbeats faded, Cora dropped the axe. Her hands were shaking. She walked over to the stump and picked up the vellum. The wax seal was heavy, arrogant. She broke it. The calligraphy was elegant looping gold ink that announced the union of Alpha Desmond and Lady Lyanna. At the bottom, in Desmond's own sharp, aggressive handwriting, was a note. "Your presence is required. It is time you accepted your place." He didn't just want her there for optics. He wanted to humiliate her. He wanted Lyanna to see the broken, dirt-stained woman he had cast aside to elevate his new mate by contrasting her with his old one. He wanted Cora to bow her head and submit to the new regime. Cora walked into her cabin. The fire was dying in the hearth. She looked at the invitation, then at the embers. It would make excellent kindling. But she didn't throw it in. She walked over to the small, cracked mirror hanging above her wash basin. She looked at herself. Hollow cheeks, dark circles under her eyes, hair like a bird's nest, a ragged wool sweater that smelled of smoke and wet dog. She looked exactly like the pathetic, discarded thing Desmond wanted her to be. Something snapped inside her. It wasn't the fiery, passionate anger of a scorned lover. It was something colder, harder. It was the cynical realization that if she stayed here and rotted, he won. "My place," she whispered to the empty room. She folded the invitation and slipped it into her pocket. She wasn't going to the wedding to bow. She was going to leave. She would cross the High Ridge Pass, leave Ashdown territory forever, and she would do it on the day of his bonding, so her scent would vanish from his lands at the exact moment he tried to claim a new mate. Let him feel the finality of it. She grabbed a rucksack and began to pack. The High Ridge was treacherous even in high summer. In the grip of early winter, it was a death trap. Cora had been walking for 2 days. Her boots were worn, the leather cracked and leaking freezing water with every step. The wind howled through the narrow mountain passes, carrying biting needles of ice that tore at her exposed skin. Her wolf, usually a source of internal warmth, was quiet, curled into a tight, depressed ball within her mind, still traumatized by the severed bond. She was hungry. She had managed to snare a skinny snow hare the first night, but she was burning calories faster than she could consume them. By the time dusk began to fall on the second day, the sky turning a bruised purple, she knew she had to find shelter or freeze. She smelled the smoke before she saw the fire. Wood smoke. Not a forest fire, but a controlled, steady burn. Pine and dry oak. Cora froze, dropping into a crouch behind a snow-draped boulder, her senses strained. The scent of another wolf hit her. Male, powerful, but unfamiliar. It lacked the underlying pine and iron scent of the Ashdown pack. A rogue. A rogue in the mountains would kill her for her boots alone. But freezing to death was a certainty, whereas a rogue was only a probability of death. Cora slipped her hunting knife from her belt and crept forward. Through a break in the rocks, she saw a small clearing sheltered by an overhang. A fire crackled merrily in the center. Sitting on a log beside it was a man. He didn't look like a starving rogue. He was massive, his shoulders broad under a heavy, worn leather coat. He was turning a spit over the fire, and the smell of roasting venison made Cora's stomach cramp violently. His dark hair was tied back, and a rough beard covered his jaw. He looked rugged, road-weary, but entirely at ease. Cora shifted her weight, intending to back away. Her boot snapped a dry twig hidden under the snow. The crack sounded like a gunshot. The man didn't jump. He didn't scramble for a weapon. He simply stopped turning the spit and looked directly at the boulder she was hiding behind. His eyes were a startling, piercing amber in the firelight. "If you're going to stab me, do it quickly!" he called out. His voice was a deep, gravelly baritone that vibrated in the cold air. "If you're just hungry, come sit down. The deer was too big for one anyway." Cora hesitated. Her grip on the knife tightened. "I can hear your stomach growling from here," he added dryly. Slowly, Cora stepped out from behind the rock. She kept the knife visible, angled down but ready. She walked into the light of the fire. The man looked her up and down. His gaze was analytical, not leering. He took in her ragged clothes, her shivering frame, and finally the pale, jagged scar at the base of her throat, visible where her collar had slipped. His eyes lingered there for a fraction of a second before moving back to her face. He didn't ask. That alone made Cora like him a little bit. "Put the knife away," he said, gesturing to a large stone opposite him. "I'm Gideon. Sit, warm yourself." Cora slid the knife into its sheath, but kept her hand resting near the hilt. She sat on the cold stone, leaning as close to the fire as she dared. The heat was absolute heaven. "Cora," she said. Gideon nodded. He reached over, sliced a thick piece of meat from the roast with a vicious-looking hunting knife, and held it out to her on the blade. She took it cautiously, ignoring the grease burning her fingers, and tore into it. It was the best thing she had ever tasted. They ate in silence for a long time. The only sounds were the crackle of the fire and the howling wind above the overhang. "You're traveling light for a mountain crossing," Gideon noted, eventually wiping a bit of grease from his beard. "And you have no pack scent." "I prefer to travel alone," Cora said defensively. "A lone wolf in Ashdown territory," he mused. "Usually Desmond doesn't tolerate strays near his borders." Cora stiffened at the name. "I'm not a stray. I'm leaving." Gideon leaned back, crossing his long legs at the ankles. He studied her in the flickering light. "Leaving in a hurry, it seems, into a blizzard, running from something or someone, neither." Cora stared into the flames. "Just realize there's nothing left for me behind me." Gideon's gaze was heavy. "A broken bond is a hard thing to carry." Cora's head snapped up, her eyes narrowing. "I didn't ask for your sympathy." "I didn't offer any," Gideon replied evenly. "Sympathy is useless. It doesn't keep you warm and it doesn't feed you. I was merely stating a fact." Cora relaxed, slightly surprised by his pragmatism. It matched her own bitter mood perfectly. "It's an old wound. It doesn't hurt anymore." It was a lie, and they both knew it. "If it doesn't hurt, why are you risking death on the high ridge instead of using the main roads?" Gideon asked. Cora sighed, pulling her knees to her chest. There was something about this stranger, something steady and unshakable that made her want to talk. Maybe it was just the relief of being warm. "Because the main roads go through the capital, and the capital is busy preparing for a wedding." Gideon's eyebrows rose. "Ah, the Alpha's bonding. You know of it. Word travels. A significant political union. Desmond of Ashdown and Lyanna of the Riverlands. A consolidation of power in the north." Gideon poked the fire with a stick, sending a shower of sparks into the dark. "You were his mate." He didn't frame it as a question. He had put the pieces together. The scar, the location, the bitterness. "I was—" Cora said, her voice hard. "Until I wasn't. I'm a half-blood. My wolf is small. I don't look good in silk, and I don't know how to play politics. So he threw me away to make room for someone who does. And now he marries her," Gideon said thoughtfully. "And you freeze on a mountain." "I received an invitation," Cora said, pulling the crumpled vellum from her pocket and tossing it onto the dirt near the fire. "He requested my presence. To watch. To accept my place." Gideon leaned forward, picking up the invitation. He broke the remaining wax, read the note, and let out a low, dark chuckle. It wasn't a nice sound. "Arrogant. Petty," Cora corrected. "Both?" Gideon agreed. He looked at her, his amber eyes catching the firelight, burning with a sudden intense intelligence. "Are you going to let him get away with it? I'm leaving. That's me not playing his game. Running away is exactly his game, Cora. It proves him right. It proves you are weak, that you couldn't handle it, that you scurried off into the dark like a beaten cur." Cora bristled, her pride stinging. "What would you have me do, march in there in rags and demand a seat at the high table? I have no power. I have no pack. If I go, I give him the satisfaction of breaking me publicly." Gideon stared at the invitation, then tossed it back to her. She caught it out of reflex, What if you didn't walk in as a broken, discarded mate? Gideon asked softly. What if you walked in as someone untouchable? Cora scoffed. And how do I manage that magic? Gideon didn't smile. He stood up. He was incredibly tall, towering over the fire, casting a long, imposing shadow against the rock wall. He reached into his heavy coat and pulled out something metallic. He tossed it through the air. Cora caught it. It was heavy. Solid gold. She looked down at her palm. It was a medallion intricately carved, a wolf's head crowned with winter thorns, the crest of the Alpha King. Cora's breath hitched. Her eyes snapped up to the man standing before her. The worn leather, the rough beard, the solitary camp, it was a disguise. Or a preference. You're... She couldn't say it. My name is Gideon, he said, his voice carrying an undeniable heavy command that made the dormant wolf inside Cora whimper in sudden awe. King of the Northern Territories. Cora scrambled to her feet, the medallion burning a hole in her hand. She started to lower her head to bare her neck in submission, the instinct ingrained in every wolf. Don't! Gideon snapped. She froze. I have enough people bowing to me, Gideon said, stepping around the fire. I need someone who can look an arrogant alpha in the eye and make him bleed without throwing a punch. Dawn broke over the high ridge, painting the snow in shades of pale pink and violent orange. Cora stood near the edge of the overhang, staring down at the winding valley below. Her mind was a chaotic storm. Behind her, the sound of heavy armor clinking filled the quiet air. During the night, they had not been alone. Gideon's vanguard, a dozen elite Lycan guards clad in dark iron and fur, had been camped a mile down the pass, waiting for the sun. They had arrived silently at first light, kneeling in the snow before their king, their presence turning the small campsite into a royal pavilion. Gideon walked up beside her. He had discarded the heavy, worn leather coat. Underneath, he wore a tunic of dark, heavy silk, and a thick fur mantle clasped with silver wolves. The rugged traveller was gone. The monarch remained. You're quiet, Gideon said, looking out over the same valley. I shared a roasted rabbit with the king, yelled at him, and didn't curtsy. Cora replied, her voice deadpan. I'm trying to decide if I'm going to be executed before or after breakfast. Gideon let out a brief, genuine laugh. I liked the yelling. It was honest. More honest than anything I'll hear in Ashdown. Cora turned to look at him. Why are you going to the wedding? Gideon's expression hardened. The amusement vanished, replaced by a cold, calculating edge. Desmond is ambitious. Too ambitious. Marrying Lyanna unites the two largest packs on my southern border. They control the trade routes, the timber, and a significant portion of my military reserve. You think he's planning a rebellion? I think he's testing the waters, Gideon said, turning to face her. He sent me an invitation. It wasn't a request for my blessing. It was a summons to witness his new power. He wants to show his allied alphas that he can draw the king down from the mountain. He wants to look like my equal. Cora understood perfectly. It was the exact same tactic Desmond was using on her, just played on a geopolitical scale. Humiliate the weak to elevate the strong. And you're going to let him? She asked. I am going to attend, Gideon corrected. But I have no intention of playing his game. I need to remind Desmond and every alpha in that hall exactly where the power lies. I need to shatter his illusion of control, disrupt his perfect narrative. Gideon stepped closer. He was a head taller than her, smelling of ozone, cold iron, and alpha dominance. But he kept his aura reined in, not pressing her down. That is where you come in, Cora. Cora crossed her arms, shivering as a gust of wind hit them. I don't follow. I'm a nobody. I'm the trash he took out. Showing up with me doesn't make you look powerful. It makes you look like a scavenger. You underestimate the symbolism. Gideon said softly. Desmond discarded you because he deemed you unworthy. He made a public spectacle of your rejection to prove his superior judgment. What happens when the king of all Lycans arrives at his bonding ceremony with his discarded mate on his arm, draped in royal colours? Cora's eyes widened as the sheer vindictive brilliance of the plan sank in. "It tells the world," Gideon continued, his voice dropping to a dangerous murmur, "that Desmond's judgment is flawed. It says that what Desmond threw away the crown found valuable. It elevates you above him. He will be forced to bow to you, Cora, to welcome you as an honoured guest in the home he threw you out of." Cora's breath hitched. She pictured it. Desmond's face. Lyanna's smug smile faltering. The whispers of the Pack Council. The absolute, unadulterated humiliation of the man who had broken her heart. The phantom pain in her chest flared, then went entirely numb, replaced by a rush of adrenaline. "You want to use me as a political weapon," she stated plainly. "Yes," Gideon answered without hesitation. He didn't sugarcoat it. He didn't try to wrap it in a fairy tale. He respected her enough to tell the ugly truth. "I use you to destabilize Desmond. You use me to get your revenge. It is a transaction." Cora looked down at her muddy boots, then at her calloused, blistered hands. "Look at me, Gideon. I'm a feral woman living in a shack. I don't know how to walk in a royal court. I don't have the dresses, the jewels, the manners. Desmond will just laugh." Gideon reached out. He didn't touch her face. He wasn't overly familiar, but he placed a large, warm hand on her shoulder. His grip was firm grounding. "A dress can be tailored. Jewels can be bought. Dirt can be washed off." Gideon said, his amber eyes locking onto hers. "But the fire I saw in you last night, the woman who looked an Alpha King in the eye and told him she didn't want his pity that cannot be bought, that is what I need." He stepped back, giving her space. "We have 3 days until the ceremony. My southern estate is a day's ride from here. We have tailors, tutors, whatever you need. If you agree you ride with me, you stand by my side, and when this is over you will have a place in my court safe from Desmond forever. Or you can walk down this mountain, disappear into the snow, and let him win." Cora looked back at the trail she had carved through the snow. She thought of her cold cabin. She thought of the heavy red wax seal and the arrogant handwriting. "Your presence is required. It is time you accepted your place." She reached into her pocket, pulled out the crumpled invitation, and held it up. She looked Gideon in the eye, her jaw set, her cynical heart beating a steady war drum rhythm. "I'll need a very expensive dress," Cora said. Gideon's mouth curved into a sharp, dangerous smile. "You shall have the finest in the kingdom." He turned to his guards. "Saddle the horses, we ride for the winter estate." As the camp sprang into organized chaos around them, Cora looked down at the invitation one last time. She didn't throw it in the fire. She folded it carefully and put it back in her pocket. She was going to hand it to Desmond personally. The water in the copper tub was scalding, biting into Cora's freezing skin with ruthless efficiency. She didn't flinch. She sat perfectly still as 2 stone-faced maids scrubbed a layer of mountain grime, pine sap, and dried blood from her arms. The water darkened quickly. They were in the east wing of Gideon's winter estate, a sprawling fortress of dark granite and heavy timber nestled in a high valley. It smelled of beeswax wood smoke and ancient wealth. There were no gilded cages or velvet lounges here. It was a military stronghold built for a warrior king. A severe older woman named Martha directed the maids. She didn't offer pitying glances or clucking sympathy. She looked at Cora like a blacksmith looked at a piece of rough iron, something to be heated, hammered, and shaped. Her hands are calloused. One of the maids murmured, applying a harsh pumice stone to Cora's palms. "Leave them!" Martha snapped, handing Cora a thick linen towel as she stood from the tub. The king did not ask for a porcelain doll. He asked for a weapon. Calluses show she survived. Cora dried off her skin, flushed red from the heat and the scrubbing. She felt lighter, the physical weight of her exile washing down the drain, but her chest remained tight. 3 days. In 3 days she would stand in front of Desmond. The wardrobe they presented to her was not a collection of ethereal flowing gowns. Gideon understood the assignment. The garments were structural, heavy, and imposing. They settled on a gown of midnight blue velvet so dark it swallowed the light. The bodice was stiff-boned with whalebone to force a perfectly rigid posture. The sleeves were long and tight, embroidered at the cuffs with subtle silver thread that caught the light like the edge of a blade. It didn't make her look like a delicate flower. It made her look like a night sky just before a storm. Martha fastened a heavy silver choker around Cora's neck. It sat high, covering the jagged, pale scar of her broken mating bond entirely. The cold metal against her throat was a harsh, comforting anchor. "Breathe," Martha instructed, pulling the laces at her back tight. "I can't," Cora wheezed. "You will learn. Weak wolves pant. Royal companions breathe from the diaphragm." When they were finished, Cora stared into the full-length looking glass. She didn't recognize the woman staring back. The hollow cheeks were still there, but enhanced by artful shading to look angular and aristocratic rather than starved. Her dark hair was pulled back into a severe, intricate braided crown interwoven with silver wire. She looked sharp. She looked dangerous. The heavy oak door opened. Gideon stepped into the room. He had also shed his travel gear. He wore a high-collared tunic of charcoal wool fastened with silver clasps down his broad chest. A heavy cloak of black bear fur rested on his shoulders. He radiated a quiet, suffocating authority. He stopped a few feet from her, his amber eyes sweeping over the transformation. He didn't smile. He didn't offer empty compliments. "Does it fit?" he asked, his gravelly voice cutting through the quiet room. "It's heavy," Cora said honestly, "and I can barely bend my waist." "Good, you won't be bowing to anyone." Gideon stepped closer, his scent of ozone and cold iron wrapping around her, grounding her. "Desmond will look for weakness. He will look for the feral, heartbroken girl he threw out. If you fidget, you lose. If you look down, you lose. You do not speak unless spoken to, and when you speak softly. Make them lean in to hear you." Cora met his gaze in the mirror. "What if I freeze? What if I see him and I just break?" Gideon turned her around by her shoulders, forcing her to face him directly. His grip was entirely impersonal, yet fiercely supportive. "You will not break," Gideon said, "because you are not alone in that hall. You are walking in under my crest. If he insults you, he insults the crown. If he touches you, it is an act of war. You have the full weight of the Northern Army standing behind you, Cora. Let him see that." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a heavy silver signet ring. It bore the same crowned wolf head as his medallion. He took her right hand and slid it onto her index finger. It was cold and heavy. "You are no longer Cora of the Fringes," he murmured, stepping back. "You are the honored companion of the king. Now let us go ruin a wedding." The journey south took 2 days by carriage. It was not a quiet trip. Gideon's royal procession was designed to be seen. A vanguard of 30 heavily armored Lycan riders flanked the massive, iron-reinforced carriage. Banners bearing the king's crest snapped violently in the bitter winter wind. The ground shook beneath the synchronized thud of massive war horses. When they crossed the border into Ashdown territory, the air shifted. The scent of pine and iron grew heavier, thicker. Cora's stomach tied itself into agonizing tight knots. She recognized the winding roads, the sprawling evergreen forests, the jagged peaks in the distance. She had hunted these woods. She had bled on this soil. The main road leading to Desmond's fortress was lined with pack members. They had gathered to watch the arrival of the allied Alphas, expecting a parade of finery and celebration. Instead, they got a military occupation. Gideon's riders parted the crowds with ruthless efficiency. The pack members, sensing the overwhelming alpha aura of the king, fell silent. They bowed their heads, baring their necks in instinctual submission as the black carriage rolled past. Cora sat stiffly on the velvet bench, staring straight ahead. She could smell them. She smelled the baker, the blacksmith of the warriors who used to spar with her. And they could smell her. She saw the confusion ripple through the crowd outside the carriage window. Noses twitched, eyes widened. They caught the familiar scent of the discarded mate, but it was mixed with the overwhelming, terrifying scent of the Alpha King. It broke their minds. Whispers began to erupt like a lit powder keg, trailing the carriage all the way to the fortress gates. The heavy iron gates of Ashdown Fortress groaned open. The courtyard was packed. Alphas from a dozen allied packs stood in their finest furs, laughing and drinking spiced wine. At the top of the grand stone stairs stood Desmond. He was broad-shouldered and handsome in a rugged, arrogant way. He wore a coat of crimson wool, a heavy gold chain resting on his chest. Beside him stood Lyanna. She was objectively beautiful, tall, willowy, with hair the color of spun gold and perfectly tailored silk that clung to her curves. They looked like the perfect rulers. The carriage ground to a halt. The courtyard fell dead silent. Every eye was fixed on the black door. One of Gideon's guards stepped forward and pulled the heavy door open. Gideon stepped out first. He didn't look around. He didn't acknowledge the gasps or the immediate frantic bowing of the allied Alphas. He simply turned, reached into the carriage, and offered his hand. Cora took a shallow breath, expanding her diaphragm against the rigid whalebone of her corset. She placed her gloved hand in Gideon's. She stepped out into the freezing air. The silence in the courtyard shattered. It wasn't a roar of noise, but a collective, sucking gasp of pure shock. Gregory, standing near the bottom of the stairs, dropped his goblet of wine. It clattered against the cobblestones, a sharp ringing sound in the dead quiet, spilling red liquid across the snow. Cora didn't look at Gregory. She didn't look at the whispering Alphas. She fixed her gaze directly on the top of the stairs. Desmond's face had drained of all color. His jaw hung slightly slack. His eyes, usually burning with aggressive confidence, were wide with a mixture of disbelief and sudden, visceral panic. He stared at the heavy velvet gown, the silver choker masking his discarded mark, and the massive signet ring on her finger. Lyanna looked confused, her perfect smile faltering as she glanced between her new mate and the imposing woman holding the king's arm. Gideon tucked Cora's hand firmly into the crook of his arm. He didn't rush. He led her toward the stairs at a slow, deliberate pace, forcing every single wolf in the courtyard to watch them. "Hold your head up." Gideon murmured, his voice so low, only she could hear it over the frantic whispers. "You own this stone." Cora tilted her chin up a fraction of an inch. Her heart was hammering against her ribs, but her face was a mask of cold, polished marble. She walked up the stone steps, her heavy skirts whispering against the granite. They stopped 2 steps below Desmond and Lyanna. Gideon was tall enough that he still looked down at the Ashdown Alpha. Desmond swallowed hard. He recovered his composure with the speed of a seasoned politician, plastering a tight, forced smile onto his face. He bowed low, a deep sign of respect he clearly loathed giving. "My king," Desmond said, his voice straining slightly. "We are deeply honored by your presence. We did not expect—" His eyes flicked to Cora, a flash of pure venom breaking through his facade. Such a grand arrival, Alpha Desmond. Gideon replied, his tone perfectly flat, devoid of any warmth. "I received your invitation. I found the proposition of your union intriguing. I decided to bring my honored companion to witness the spectacle." He gestured slightly to Cora. Desmond's jaw clenched so hard, Cora thought she might hear his teeth crack. He was trapped. He could not insult the king's companion, no matter who she was. "Welcome, Cora," Desmond choked out. Cora didn't smile. She didn't offer a traditional greeting of submission. She looked at him with the same flat, tired expression she had used when chopping wood at her cabin. "Desmond," she said, her voice steady and smooth. "Thank you for the invitation. It is entirely fitting that I witness you taking your place." She fed his own arrogant words right back to him. Desmond's eyes flared with rage, but he could do absolutely nothing. Lyanna, sensing the volatile shift in power, stepped forward, looping her arm through Desmond's. "We are thrilled to host you both. Please, the feast is beginning in the Great Hall. The high table awaits." "Excellent," Gideon said. He didn't wait for them to lead the way. He walked forward, forcing Desmond and Lyanna to step aside, claiming the path for himself and Cora. As they walked past, Cora caught Desmond's scent. Under the pine and iron, under the expensive cologne, was a sharp, bitter tang. Fear. The great hall of Ashdown was a cavernous space of heavy oak beams, roaring hearths and banners dripping with pack history. Long tables stretched across the stone floor, packed with the elite of the Northern Territories. At the far end sat the high table elevated on a wooden dais. It was meant to seat Desmond, Lyanna, and their immediate families, showcasing the newly unified power structure. Gideon shattered that structure the moment he walked in. He didn't wait to be seated. He bypassed the chair placed for him at Desmond's right hand. Instead, he pulled out the heavy carved chair directly in the center of the table, the seat traditionally reserved for the hosting Alpha, and gestured for Cora to sit. A murmur of shock rippled through the hall. Desmond, arriving at the dais a moment later, stopped dead. His face flushed a dark, dangerous red. "My king," he said, keeping his voice low to avoid a public scene. "That seat is perfectly comfortable." Gideon interrupted smoothly, sitting in the chair to Cora's immediate right. He looked up at Desmond, his amber eyes completely devoid of warmth. "Unless you prefer I sit with the squires by the doors, Desmond." It was a blatant power play. Gideon was reminding everyone in the room who truly owned the land beneath their feet. Desmond's chest heaved. He looked like he wanted to shift and tear someone's throat out, but against a king he was nothing. "Of course not my king," Desmond gritted out. He was forced to take the seat to Lyanna's left, pushing them to the edge of their own high table. The feast began. Servants scurried nervously, filling goblets with heavy red wine and slamming silver platters of roasted boar and venison onto the tables. The atmosphere in the hall was suffocatingly tense. No one was celebrating. They were watching a bloodless execution. Cora sat perfectly straight, the whalebone of her corset keeping her posture immaculate. She didn't touch the wine. She cut her meat into small, precise pieces, chewing methodically. Lyanna leaned forward, trying to peer past Desmond to look at Cora. Her beautiful face was marred by a condescending, strained smile. "I must say, Cora," Lyanna called out, her voice carrying just enough to be heard by the nearby tables. "We were quite surprised when the king's riders arrived. We had assumed you were still living out in the fringe woods. It must be quite a shock to your system being in a hall like this again." The hall quieted slightly. The allied alphas leaned in, eager for the drama. Lyanna was trying to remind everyone of Cora's feral, discarded status. Cora placed her silver knife down on the heavy oak table. She didn't look flustered. She didn't blush. She turned her head slowly and met Lyanna's gaze. "The fringe woods are quiet, Lady Lyanna," Cora said, her voice carrying beautifully without shouting. "It teaches one how to recognize predators and how to spot scavengers." She offered a small, entirely empty smile. The transition to this hall was quite seamless. The company is much the same. A few alphas down the table coughed to cover their sudden, shocked laughter. Lyanna's face went stiff. She had tried to mock a peasant and had been verbally gutted by a royal companion. Desmond slammed his goblet onto the table. The wine sloshed over the rim, staining the white linen. "What's your tone?" Desmond hissed, leaning forward, his alpha aura flaring aggressively, pushing against the space between them. "You may be wearing silk, Cora, but do not forget who you are addressing. You are in my house." Gideon didn't say a word. He simply stopped eating. He turned his head and looked at Desmond. He didn't flare his aura. He didn't growl. He just stared. The oppressive weight of the king's silent gaze hit Desmond like a physical blow. The aggressive flare of Desmond's aura sputtered and died instantly. The Ashdown Alpha broke eye contact, looking down at his plate, his jaw tight. Alpha Desmond is right. Cora said softly into the heavy silence. Gideon raised an eyebrow looking at her. Desmond looked back up, surprised. "I am in your house." Cora continued, her voice perfectly calm. She reached up and touched the heavy silver choker at her throat. "The house where I was judged unworthy. The house where I was told a small wolf and a lack of pedigree made me useless." She lowered her hand, letting the heavy silver signet ring on her finger catch the firelight from the hearths. "But I find it fascinating, Desmond," Cora said, leaning forward slightly, holding his gaze with absolute, unyielding coldness. "You required a political marriage to secure your borders and elevate your name. It took you months of negotiations to borrow power from the Riverlands." She let the silence stretch for a heartbeat. "It took me 3 days to walk in on the arm of the king. Tell me, Alpha, who is the weak wolf now?" The great hall fell so silent you could hear the crackle of the logs in the hearths 50 feet away. Desmond's face was ashen. He had absolutely no response. He had invited her to break her, and she had just dismantled his entire reign in front of his allies without raising her voice. Cora picked up her silver goblet, finally taking a sip of the wine. It tasted like absolute victory. The rest of the feast was an exercise in agonizing, drawn-out suffocation for the Alpha of Ashdown. Cora did not say another word to Desmond. She didn't have to. The damage was absolute. The allied Alphas, the very men Desmond had invited to witness his ascension, were seasoned political animals. They smelled the blood in the water. They saw a newly minted Alpha, humiliated at his own table, unable to defend his territory against a verbal slaughter, because he was terrified of the king sitting quietly beside the executioner. The conversations in the hall shifted. The Alphas stopped addressing Desmond directly. Instead, their eyes kept darting to the center of the table. A territorial lord from the eastern crags leaned forward and asked Gideon about the snowpack in the high passes. An older Alpha from the iron mines raised his glass in a silent, respectful toast to Cora. They were pivoting. Desmond was no longer the center of gravity in his own fortress. Lyanna tried desperately to claw back the narrative. She ordered the musicians to play louder. She signaled for more wine to be poured. She laughed a little too sharply, her voice shrill over the heavy strings of the cellos. It was useless. She was a beautiful bride sitting next to a neutered wolf. Through it all, Cora sat still. Her back ached from the rigid whalebone. The heavy velvet skirt felt like a lead weight dragging her down, but she kept her chin elevated, her hands relaxed on her lap. She felt Gideon's presence beside her, a massive radiating furnace of heat and quiet, terrifying calm. He didn't gloat. He simply occupied space, letting his sheer existence dismantle Desmond's authority. When the final course of heavy spiced pastries was cleared, Gideon stood. The entire hall fell silent again. "Alpha Desmond," Gideon said, his voice echoing off the vaulted timber ceiling. "Your hospitality is noted. We will retire for the evening. See that my guards are quartered warmly." He didn't wait for Desmond's frantic, stammering reply. He offered his arm to Cora. She took it, rising smoothly, ignoring the vicious cramp in her left thigh. They walked down the center aisle of the great hall. The crowds parted for them instantly, heads bowing, eyes averted. They walked through the heavy oak doors and out into the freezing stone corridors of the guest wing. The moment the doors shut solidly behind them, cutting off the noise of the hall, Cora stopped. She let go of Gideon's arm and leaned her back against the cold granite wall. The adrenaline which had been burning hot and fast in her veins for the last hour crashed. Her knees buckled slightly. Her hands began to shake with violent, uncontrollable tremors. Gideon didn't crowd her. He took a step back, giving her air. He reached inside his heavy fur cloak and produced a flat silver flask. He unscrewed the cap and held it out. Cora took it with both hands to steady it. She drank. It wasn't wine. It was high-proof mountain whiskey tasting of peat and fire. It burned all the way down to her stomach, chasing away the immediate chill of the corridor. She coughed, handing the flask back. "Thank you." "You are shaking." Gideon observed his amber eyes studying her in the dim light of the corridor torches. "It's the cold." Cora lied. "It is the crash." Gideon corrected mildly, taking a swig from the flask himself before capping it. "Violence takes a toll on the body, and what you just did in there was pure, unadulterated violence." Cora let out a breath that was half laugh, half sob. She pressed the heels of her hands against her eyes. "He looked so small, Gideon. I spent 6 months thinking he was a monster, thinking he was this massive, immovable force that crushed me. But looking at him tonight, he just looked desperate. Tyrants usually are," Gideon said. He leaned his shoulder against the wall opposite her, watching her carefully. "He built his entire self-worth on the submission of others. You stripped that away. You exposed the scaffolding. It is a terrifying thing for a man like him to realize he only has power because people agree to give it to him." And tonight, the room stopped agreeing. Cora lowered her hands. The makeup Martha had painstakingly applied was flawless, but her eyes were tired. "Did I ruin his alliances?" "You planted the seed of doubt," Gideon answered pragmatically. "The Eastern Lords rely on strength. They saw none tonight. They saw a man who cannot control his own past, let alone the future of the northern borders. By tomorrow, half of them will be sending ravens to my winter estate, looking to renegotiate their trade treaties directly with the crown." So your trip was a success." "Our trip," Gideon corrected softly. "I provided the stage. You swung the axe." He stepped away from the wall. The rough, pragmatic king was back. "Rest, Cora. Tomorrow is the bonding ceremony. The spectacle requires an audience for the final act." He escorted her to the door of her assigned chambers. He didn't linger. He gave her a short, respectful nod and walked down the hall to his own quarters, his heavy boots making no sound on the stone floor. Cora went inside. The room was grand, far larger than her entire cabin, with a roaring fire already built in the hearth. 2 of Gideon's royal guards stood outside her door in the hallway. She stripped off the heavy velvet dress, dropping it onto a chair. She unclasped the silver choker and set it on the vanity. She looked at her reflection in the glass. The pale, jagged scar at her throat was visible again. She touched it. For the first time in 6 months, it didn't throb. The phantom pain was gone. In its place was just a scar, dead tissue, completely numb. Desmond had cut her open, but she had finally cauterized the wound. The moonstone was an ancient, jagged slab of obsidian jutting out of the earth in the center of the fortress courtyard. It predated the Ashdown Pact. It was where blood was spilled, oaths were sworn, and souls were tethered. The morning air was brutally cold. The sky was a flat, unforgiving grey, heavy with the promise of a blizzard. The entire pack, along with the visiting dignitaries, stood in a massive circle around the stone. Their breath rose in thick white clouds, mingling with the heavy smoke of pine resin burning in iron braziers. Cora stood on the high balcony overlooking the courtyard. She was wrapped in a cloak of thick black fox fur, the silver choker back tightly around her neck. Gideon stood beside her, his hands resting on the stone balustrade. They were physically removed from the crowd, elevated above the ritual. Observers, judges. Below them, Desmond and Lyanna walked toward the moonstone. They wore ceremonial white leathers devoid of armor or heavy furs, meant to symbolize purity and vulnerability to the goddess. Desmond looked terrible. The rugged, arrogant confidence from yesterday was gone, replaced by a stiff, mechanical stiffness. He had dark circles under his eyes. Lyanna walked beside him, her face a mask of serene, practiced perfection. She played the role of the devoted mate flawlessly, but Cora could see the rigid tension in her shoulders. The humiliation of the feast hung over them like a shroud. Gregory, acting as the officiant, stood by the stone, holding a silver bowl and a ceremonial dagger. He looked deeply uncomfortable. The chanting began. It was a low, guttural hum that vibrated in the chests of the wolves gathered in the courtyard. It was supposed to be a sound of unity, of celebration. Today it sounded like a dirge. He is looking for you." Gideon murmured, his eyes fixed on the courtyard. Cora didn't move. Let him look. Down below, Desmond took the dagger from Gregory. He sliced the palm of his left hand. The dark blood welled up, instantly stark and violent against the white leather of his sleeve. He held his hand over the silver bowl, letting the blood drip. Then he paused. He didn't hand the dagger to Lyanna right away. Instead, his head tilted back. His eyes scanned the high walls of his fortress, past the banners, past the smoking braziers until he found the balcony. Even from 100 feet away, Cora felt the impact of his gaze. It was the look of a man waking up from a long, arrogant fever dream to find his house burning down. In that split second, the political maneuverings, the pursuit of a stronger bloodline, the desperate need to look powerful, it all crumbled. He looked at Cora, standing beside the king, wrapped in royal furs, completely untouchable. He remembered the woman who used to laugh in his kitchen, who chopped her own wood, who looked at him like he was the only man in the world. He had thrown away absolute loyalty for a political transaction. And now he was standing in the freezing cold, about to tether his soul to a woman who had spent the entire morning screaming at him about how he had embarrassed her in front of the king. Cora didn't flinch. She didn't look away. She stared back down at him, her expression completely unreadable. She felt no pity. She felt no lingering love. She felt absolutely nothing. Desmond's hand trembled. A drop of blood missed the bowl and splattered onto the white snow at his feet. Lyanna cleared her throat sharply, a harsh sound that cut through the low chanting. She reached out and snatched the dagger from his loose grip. She sliced her own palm without hesitation and squeezed her fist over the bowl, mixing her blood with his. Gregory began the final invocation, binding their spirits in the eyes of the pack. The moment the ritual was complete, a cheer went up from the Ashdown wolves. It was loud, but it lacked the frantic, joyous energy of a true mating. The allied alphas clapped politely. Desmond didn't kiss his new mate. He stared down at the bowl of mixed blood, his face ashen. "It is done," Gideon said quietly. He turned away from the balustrade. "We leave within the hour. Gather your things." Cora watched Desmond for 1 second longer. Then she turned her back on the courtyard and followed the king inside. The black carriage was waiting in the courtyard. The vanguard of Lycan riders was already mounted, their heavy iron armor clinking impatiently. The blizzard that had been threatening all morning was finally beginning to fall, thick, heavy flakes of snow, instantly sticking to the cobblestones. Cora stood near the open carriage door. She wore her traveling clothes, heavy wool trousers, a thick sweater, and a sturdy fur-lined coat provided by Martha. The velvet dress and the silver choker were packed away in a trunk. She felt like herself again, but an upgraded, impenetrable version. "My king." Cora turned. Desmond stood near the base of the fortress steps. He was still wearing the bloody white leathers of the ceremony. He had no cloak, and the snow was already gathering on his shoulders. He looked ragged. Lyanna was nowhere to be seen, likely inside, securing her new position among the pack elders. Gideon paused, turning slowly to face the alpha. He didn't speak. He just waited. Desmond swallowed. He didn't look at Gideon. He looked at Cora. He took a step forward, his hands twitching at his sides. "Cora, He stopped, his throat working. He looked like he wanted to apologize. He looked like he wanted to explain the politics, the pressure, the reasons why he had broken her. He wanted absolution. Cora reached into the deep pocket of her coat. Her fingers brushed against the heavy vellum parchment. She pulled it out. The red wax seal was broken. The edges crumpled from where she had carried it across the mountains, but the aggressive gold handwriting was still perfectly legible. She walked toward him. Her boots crunched heavily on the fresh snow. She didn't stop until she was 2 feet away, well within his personal space. Desmond looked down at her, his eyes wide, pleading silently for a sliver of the warmth she used to give him freely. Cora held out the invitation. Desmond looked at it. He didn't take it. "You requested my presence," Cora said, Her voice was quiet, completely devoid of malice. It was just a statement of fact. You wanted me to witness your new power. You wanted me to accept my place. She reached out and tucked the crumpled invitation into the front pocket of his ceremonial leather tunic. She patted the leather once, a gesture so dismissive it made Desmond physically flinch. I accept it, Cora said. Enjoy your marriage, Desmond. She didn't wait for a response. She turned her back on him and walked straight to the carriage. Gideon offered his hand. She took it, pulling herself up into the dark, leather-scented interior. Gideon climbed in after her, pulling the heavy door shut. The lock engaged with a loud final click. "Move out!" Gideon barked out the window to his captain. The carriage lurched forward. The heavy wheels crushed the snow, rumbling out of the courtyard, and through the massive iron gates of Ashdown Fortress. Cora sat back against the leather seat. She closed her eyes. The tension that had lived in her shoulders for 6 agonizing months evaporated, leaving her feeling light, almost hollow. It was over. The ghost was dead. They rode in silence for a long time. The only sound was the howling of the wind outside and the rhythmic thud of the horses' hooves. The road climbed steadily, taking them away from the pine forests and back toward the high, frozen mountains of the king's territory. Gideon sat across from her, his long legs stretched out, his bearskin cloak draped over the seat. He was watching the snow whip past the window. "You didn't have to give him the invitation," Gideon said eventually, without looking away from the glass. "You had already won. I didn't do it to win," Cora said, opening her eyes. "I did it to give it back. It was heavy. I didn't want to carry it anymore." Gideon turned his head, his amber eyes settling on her. The harsh tactical king who had dismantled a territory at dinner was gone. He looked like the rugged man sitting by the fire in the snow again. "The transaction is complete," Gideon stated. His voice was lower now, lacking the booming authority of the court. "You disrupted Desmond's alliances. You served your purpose perfectly." Cora nodded slowly. "And you gave me my revenge. A debt paid on both sides. So where do you drop me off the nearest trading town?" Gideon frowned. The expression looked strange on his usually stoic face. "I told you on the mountain. You have a place in my court." "I know what you said," Cora replied, pulling her knees up slightly, getting comfortable. "But that was the pitch to get me in the carriage. I'm a feral half-blood Gideon. I don't belong in high halls permanently. You don't need a fake royal companion anymore." Gideon uncrossed his legs and leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. The carriage swayed violently as they hit a rut, but he remained perfectly still, a center of gravity in the small space. "I don't want a fake companion," Gideon said softly. Cora stared at him, her breath hitching slightly. "I have a court full of politicians." Gideon continued, his eyes locked onto hers with that same terrifying, unshakable intensity she had seen the first night they met. "I have generals who tell me what I want to hear. I have nobles who smile to my face and scheme in the shadows. What I do not have is someone who will eat a charred rabbit in the snow, look a king in the eye, and tell him to keep his pity to himself." He reached across the small space between them. He didn't grab her hand. He simply rested his large, calloused palm up on the leather seat next to her knee. An invitation. A real one this time. "The seat on my council is not a reward for playing a part, Cora. It is an offer to the woman who played it," Gideon said. "You survived the fringes. You survived a broken bond. You walked into a den of wolves and made the alpha choke on his own arrogance. I need that mind on my council. I need that resilience in my territory." He let the words hang in the air, heavy and genuine. And Gideon added the absolute faintest hint of a smile touching the corner of his mouth beneath his rough beard. "I need someone to remind me that a title doesn't save a man from snapping a dry twig and ruining a hunt." Cora looked at his large, scarred hand resting on the seat. She thought of the cold, empty cabin waiting for her in the fringes. She thought of the endless running, the hiding the quiet, pathetic existence of a discarded wolf. Then she looked at the King of the North. a man who had handed her a sword when everyone else had told her to lie down and bleed. Cora reached out. She didn't hesitate. She placed her hand in his. His fingers closed around hers, warm, solid, and incredibly grounding. There was no magical spark, no fated mate cliché of exploding stars. It was just the firm, unbreakable grip of two survivors recognizing the steel in one another. A council seat. Cora murmured a genuine, cynical smile, finally breaking across her face. I suppose that means I have to wear the corset again. Gideon let out a rough, booming laugh that easily drowned out the howling blizzard outside. Only when we have company to terrify. The rest of the time the king commands that you wear whatever you damn well please. The carriage plunged deeper into the northern mountains, leaving the ghost of Ashdown buried beneath the snow forever. Thank you for watching. If Cora's epic revenge and her new beginning with the Alpha King had you on the edge of your seat, smash that like button right now. Don't forget to share this story with someone who loves a fierce, unapologetic comeback. Want more original werewolf dramas, dark romances, and tales of survival? Hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell so you never miss a new upload. Drop a comment below. What was your favorite moment of Desmond's downfall? See you in the next story.